Why does a people who live on some of the poorest land in Westeros dream so relentlessly of conquest? The question hangs over the Iron Islands like sea mist over black cliffs. Again and again throughout the history of the Seven Kingdoms, kings, maesters, septons, and conquerors looked westward toward those windswept rocks and assumed the Ironborn would eventually change. Yet centuries passed, dynasties rose and vanished, dragons came and went, great castles were built and burned, and still the men of the islands launched their longships into dark waters, speaking the same ancient prayers their ancestors had spoken long before the coming of the Targaryens. Tonight, as the waves roll endlessly against the shores of Old Wick and Pike, you are going to drift through the untold history of the Iron Islands and the mysterious God who waits beneath the sea. If you have joined these journeys before, quietly note which night of the voyage this is for you. If you are new here, simply call it Night 1. There is no hurry. The sea has been patient for thousands of years. The Iron Islands have stood beneath storms longer than any living person can comprehend, and their stories seem to emerge from the surf itself, carried on salt wind and the cries of distant gulls. So settle comfortably and let the cold waters of the Sunset Sea carry you backward through the ages. A storm is gathering beyond the horizon. Great waves rise and collapse against jagged rocks below the castle of Pike. The ancient fortress stands broken into separate towers, linked by swaying rope bridges suspended above the sea. Far beneath those bridges, seawater crashes into caves hollowed out by centuries of relentless tides. A drowned priest stands waist deep in the surf. His robes cling to him like seaweed. Around him wait silent figures with wet hair and salt-stained cloaks. The priest lowers a young initiate beneath the water. For a moment, there is only darkness and the roar of the sea. Then the youth is pulled back upward, coughing violently as cold air rushes into his lungs. The priest places a hand upon his head and speaks words known throughout the islands. What is dead may never die, but rises again, harder and stronger. Those words are among the oldest in Westeros, older than the Iron Throne, older than the Seven Kingdoms, older, according to Ironborn tradition, than the arrival of the Andals. They belong to a faith unlike any other on the continent. While most of southern Westeros follows the faith of the Seven and the North keeps the old gods of the Weirwoods, the Ironborn worship the drowned god, Lord of the Sea beneath the waves. Their religion teaches that death itself is not an ending. A man can drown and return stronger. A people can be defeated and rise again. Even an entire way of life can survive centuries of pressure and change. Understanding that belief is the key to understanding the Iron Islands themselves. But before we can understand their faith, another mystery demands attention. Why did such a distinct culture survive at all? Look at a map of Westeros. The Iron Islands lie off the continent's western coast between the Sunset Sea and the shores of the Riverlands and Westerlands. There are 7 principal islands: Pike, Great Wyke, Old Wick, Harlaw, Orkmont, Blacktide, and Salt Cliff. Smaller rocks and islets surround them, but these 7 form the heart of Ironborn civilization. Their lands are harsh, their fields are thin, the soil is stony, winters strike hard. Compared to the fertile Reach, the rich river valleys of the Riverlands, or even the rugged north, the Iron Islands possess remarkably few natural advantages. Yet from these barren shores emerged one of the most feared peoples in Westerosi history. The geography explains more than it first appears. On Great Week, towering cliffs overlook dangerous waters where storms can arrive with terrifying speed. Orkmont rises from the sea in rocky ridges. Black Tide faces the open ocean, exposed to endless winds from the west. Harlaw, larger and more fertile than many of its neighbors, became home to some of the island's most influential noble houses. Even today, House Harlaw remains among the most powerful vassals of House Greyjoy. Yet none of these islands possess the broad farmlands that allowed other kingdoms to grow wealthy through agriculture. The sea provided fish, the sea provided trade routes, and eventually the sea provided opportunities for something else entirely. What happens when survival depends upon waters that connect you to richer lands? The answer shaped Ironborn culture for thousands of years. Across generations, men learned shipbuilding before they learned letters. Boys dreamed of captaining longships. Noble houses measured prestige through voyages, victories, and captured wealth. While mainland lords expanded through fields and castles, the Ironborn looked outward across the waves. Their identity became inseparable from the sea itself. Even their rulers sat upon a throne unlike any other in Westeros. The Seastone chair, ancient and mysterious, stands in pike carved from oily black stone. No one knows who made it. No reliable record explains its origin. The chair simply exists, already ancient when written history begins. That mystery of the Seastone chair is only the first of many strange details surrounding the islands. The chair's black stone resembles other mysterious structures scattered across the known world. Maesters have noted similarities to the oily black stone found in distant places, such as Ashai by the Shadow and on the Isle of Toads in Sothorios. Yet no clear connection has ever been established. The Ironborn themselves rarely concern themselves with such academic questions. To them, the Seastone chair is proof of ancient kingship. Their rulers occupied it long before Aegon the Conqueror forged the Iron Throne, long before Old Town became a center of learning, long before the Citadel sent maesters to every corner of the realm. The oldest traditions of the islands point toward a time so distant that history dissolves into legend. Most regions of Westeros preserve stories of heroic founders. The North remembers Brandon the Builder, credited with constructing Winterfell and the Wall after the Long Night. House Lannister traces its origins to Lan the Clever. The Stormlands celebrate Durin God's grief. Yet the Ironborn possess something stranger. Their greatest ancestral figure is not merely a king. He is almost a mythological force. His name echoes through every generation of Ironborn storytelling. They call him the Grey King. According to the legends preserved on Old Wick, the Grey King ruled for 1,000 years. No maester accepts that figure literally, but the stories remain important because they reveal how the Ironborn see themselves. The Grey King fought the Storm God, the eternal enemy of mankind in Ironborn belief. He sailed the seas when the world was young. Most famously, he slew Naga, a gigantic sea dragon. The stories claim that Naga's living fire once warmed entire halls. After defeating the beast, the Grey King supposedly built his hall from its bones and roofed it with its jaws. Even now on Old Wick, enormous weathered ribs rise from the ground around the site known as Naga's Hill. Those bones create one of the most intriguing puzzles In all of Ironborn history, what exactly are they? The Ironborn insist they are Naga's remains. Maesters generally argue that the bones belong to giant ancient whales or some other enormous sea creature, yet neither explanation resolves every question. The ribs are undeniably massive. They have stood there for centuries, surviving storms that shattered lesser structures. During the War of the Five Kings, it is at Naga's Hill that Aaron Damphair summons the King's Moot to choose a new ruler after the death of Balan Greyjoy. Thousands gather beneath those ancient bones. Priests, captains, warriors, and noble houses stand where countless generations stood before them. Whatever the truth behind Naga, the location possesses immense spiritual power. The Grey King legend grows even stranger. The tales say he took a mermaid wife from the sea. They claim he learned to weave nets from the children of the drowned god. Some stories say he stole fire from the storm god himself. Others claim ravens first came to men during his reign, bringing knowledge and messages. These stories sound fantastical, yet they preserve fragments of an ancient worldview. In them, the sea is not merely water. It is a living realm filled with divine forces. The ocean gives blessings. The ocean takes lives. The ocean rewards courage and punishes weakness. Every Ironborn child grows up hearing these ideas long before they ever set foot aboard a ship. And this brings us back to the central mystery. Why does so much of Ironborn culture revolve around struggle? Why is their greatest hero remembered not as a builder, a lawgiver, or a peacemaker, but as a warrior who battled gods and monsters? The answer may lie deep within the islands themselves, surrounded by dangerous waters, battered by storms, and separated from richer lands. The Ironborn developed a world view where survival demanded strength. The Grey King became the perfect ancestral symbol. He did not inherit comfort. He wrestled it from an unforgiving world. In that sense, whether he truly existed almost becomes secondary. The legend tells the Ironborn who they believe they are. As the wind continues to howl across Old Week and the surf pounds against the black rocks below, the ancient bones of Naga stand silent beneath the stars. Generations have come and gone beneath them. Kings have risen, kings have drowned. Yet the questions remain. Who was the Grey King? What memories hide beneath the layers of myth? And why do so many of the oldest Ironborn stories feel less like fairy tales and more like echoes from a forgotten age waiting beneath the waves? Why does the faith of the drowned god survive when so many ancient religions have faded into memory? The question becomes even stranger when you consider the history of Westeros as a whole. The children of the forest once worshipped nameless spirits through weirwoods. The first men adopted many of those beliefs. Then came the UNTOLDs, carrying the faith of the Seven across the continent. Entire kingdoms abandoned older traditions. Great septs rose where sacred groves once stood. Yet on the Iron Islands, the drowned god endured, not merely as a collection of customs, but as the living heart of an entire people. The faith itself is remarkably simple when compared with the elaborate hierarchy of the Seven. There is no equivalent of the High Septon, no vast temple complex like the Starry Sept of Old Town, no scripture comparable to the Seven-Pointed Star. Instead, the religion is carried by drowned priests who travel among villages, harbors, and noble halls. They preach from beaches rather than pulpits. Their ceremonies take place in surf and sea water, their authority comes not from crowns or councils, but from perceived closeness to the god beneath the waves. A drowned priest often appears more like a weathered sailor than a religious leader. Among the most famous of these priests is Aaron Greyjoy, later known as Aaron Damphair. Born the youngest surviving son of Lord Quelyn Greyjoy, Aaron spent much of his youth drinking, fighting, and sailing. During his early life, he bore little resemblance to the severe religious figure he would become. Everything changed after a near-fatal experience at sea. Aaron was swept overboard during a storm and nearly drowned. When he survived, he interpreted the event as a direct encounter with the drowned god. From that day forward, he abandoned his former life and devoted himself entirely to the faith. Through Aaron's chapters in A Feast for Crows and the Winds of Winter preview material, readers receive the clearest look at Ironborn religion anywhere in the canon. He conducts baptisms by fully submerging initiates in seawater. The ritual is intentionally dangerous. Participants are held beneath the surface until consciousness fades. Only afterward are they revived. The symbolism is obvious and powerful. One dies to the old self and returns transformed. When Aaron performs the ceremony, the gathered Ironborn answer his prayer with the familiar response, "What is dead may never die, but rises again, harder and stronger." Yet another mystery emerges here. Why does drowning sit at the center of a seafaring culture? Sailors throughout history feared the sea because it could kill without warning. Storms, reefs, hidden currents, and shattered hulls claimed countless lives. Most maritime peoples developed traditions aimed at avoiding drowning. The Ironborn instead transformed drowning into a sacred act. Death by water became not merely accepted but spiritually meaningful. Their faith turns their greatest natural danger into a source of identity. What terrifies outsiders becomes holy. The drowned god exists in constant opposition to another divine force, the storm god. Unlike the seven, who represent different aspects of one deity, the drowned god and storm god are locked in eternal conflict. According to Ironborn belief, the storm god dwells in dark clouds and raging seas. He sends winds to wreck ships. He hurls lightning against sailors. He creates obstacles for mankind. The drowned god, meanwhile, welcomes his faithful into underwater halls after death, where they feast forever beside mermaids and legendary heroes. This conflict appears throughout Ironborn mythology. The Grey King is said to have fought the storm god repeatedly. Some legends claim he cut down Ygg, a mighty tree whose fire he stole from the storm god's domain. Others say he challenged storms themselves, refusing to bow before divine hostility. These stories are difficult to separate from myth, but they reveal something important. Ironborn religion is not centered upon harmony. It is centered upon struggle. The faithful do not expect the world to be gentle. Their greatest heroes earn glory through resistance. One of the most distinctive aspects of Ironborn belief concerns wealth. Throughout most of Westeros, prosperity comes through inheritance, trade, farming, mining, or service to a lord. The Ironborn preserve a different ideal. They speak of paying the iron price rather than the gold price. A sword purchased with coin is less honorable than one taken through courage and violence. A treasure seized during a raid carries greater prestige than one bought peacefully. The phrase appears repeatedly throughout the novels, shaping how many Ironborn nobles understand status and achievement. Of course, reality proved more complicated than ideology. Even during the height of the old way, trade remained essential. Iron-borne ships exchanged goods with mainland ports. Lords collected taxes. Noble houses accumulated wealth through methods far less romantic than heroic songs suggested. Yet the ideal remained powerful because ideals often matter more than facts. A young warrior dreaming of glory did not imagine ledgers and harbor fees. He imagined standing on the deck of a longship with salt spray on his face, returning home with treasure won through courage. What exactly was the old way? The phrase appears constantly in iron-borne history, but it refers to more than raiding alone. The old way describes an entire social order. Captives taken during raids became thralls, effectively serving as laborers and slaves. Women taken during conquests could become salt wives. Noble prestige depended heavily upon martial success. Kings expanded influence through longships rather than diplomacy. The system created fierce warriors and skilled sailors. It also generated endless cycles of violence that brought the islands into conflict with nearly every neighboring kingdom. The noble houses of the Iron Islands grew within this culture. House Greyjoy ruled from Pike. House Harlaw established itself on the island of Harlaw, eventually becoming renowned for learning as well as martial strength. House Goodbrother held extensive lands on Great Wyke. House Blacktide ruled Blacktide Island. House Botley controlled Lordsport on Pike. House Drum, House Merlin, House Stonehouse, and many others contributed to the complex web of iron-born politics. Though outsiders often imagine the Iron Islands as a unified culture, rivalries among these houses stretch back centuries. Why did such a system survive for so long? Geography again offers part of the answer. The island's rocky terrain limited opportunities for agricultural wealth. Raiding could produce dramatic rewards. More importantly, success at sea reinforced the values already embedded in the culture. Each victorious voyage became evidence that the drowned god favored the old way. Every captured ship seemed to confirm ancient teachings. Defeat could always be blamed on weakness, poor leadership, or insufficient faith. In this manner, belief and experience reinforced each other across generations. Yet a challenge was approaching from across the narrow sea and from the southern shores of Westeros. The Andals were coming, armed with steel, carrying the faith of the Seven, and driven by conquest. They transformed nearly every region they touched. Kingdoms fell before them. Noble houses vanished. Entire cultures changed. The Iron Islands would not escape their arrival. The truly remarkable story is not that the Andals invaded the islands. The remarkable story is that after centuries of warfare, intermarriage, and settlement, the drowned god still ruled the hearts of the Ironborn. In the next chapter of their history, bloodlines would change, castles would change, even kings would change, but the sea would keep its grip on the islands, and the old god beneath the waves would refuse to drown. Why did the Andals conquer nearly every kingdom in Westeros, yet fail to conquer the soul of the Iron Islands? It is one of the most remarkable cultural mysteries in the history of the continent. The Andal migrations reshaped the Vale, the Riverlands, the Reach, the Westerlands, and much of the Stormlands. Ancient dynasties vanished. New noble houses emerged. The faith of the Seven spread behind Andal swords. Yet when the long process finally reached the Iron Islands, something unexpected happened. The invaders changed the people, but the people changed the invaders as well. The Andals arrived in waves rather than through a single dramatic conquest. Different warlords landed on different islands. Battles were fought. Alliances were forged. Marriages connected conquerors to local rulers. Over generations, many of the great houses of the islands acquired substantial Andal ancestry. House Harlaw, House Good Brother, House Blacktide, and others incorporated Andal blood into their lineages. By the time reliable historical records become more common, many Ironborn nobles descended from both First Men and Andal ancestors. Yet ancestry proved easier to change than identity. The evidence survives even in noble names. Many Ironborn lords carried names that reflected Andal influence. Castles were rebuilt in styles familiar across southern Westeros. Knights occasionally appeared among the island's elite. Trade connections expanded. Certain customs from the mainland took root, but the drowned god remained. The old prayers remained. The kings continued to sit upon the sea-stone chair. Most importantly, the Ironborn continued to define themselves as Ironborn rather than Andals. The conquerors had crossed the sea expecting to transform the islands. Instead, the islands absorbed them. One reason becomes apparent when examining religion. Throughout the rest of southern Westeros, the faith of the Seven often became the foundation of Andal rule. Septons accompanied armies, septs followed victories. Local populations gradually adopted the new faith. On the Iron Islands, however, the Seven never established the same dominance. Small septs existed. Some noble families maintained connections to the faith. House Blacktide, in particular, developed a reputation for being more receptive to mainland influences, yet the drowned priests never disappeared. The sea itself remained a stronger symbol than any sept bell. Another factor lay in the geography, already shaping Ironborn life. An invading Andal lord who captured territory in the Reach inherited fertile fields and prosperous villages. An invading Andal lord on Great Wick inherited rocks, storms, and neighbors who measured strength differently. To rule successfully, he often needed ships. He needed warriors. He needed acceptance from local captains. Gradually, practical necessity encouraged adaptation. The islands imposed their own lessons upon newcomers. A man could arrive as an Andal conqueror and find his grandchildren behaving like Ironborn reavers. What did not change was the prestige of the old way. Throughout these centuries, longships remained central to Ironborn power. Raids continued along western shores. Captains competed for glory and wealth. The iron price retained its cultural force. Young nobles grew up hearing stories of legendary sea kings rather than Andal saints. Even when mainland customs appeared in daily life, the deeper mythology remained rooted in the sea. Every storm reinforced the lessons taught by the drowned god. Every voyage reminded sailors that survival depended upon courage rather than comfort. Yet the Iron Islands were not frozen in time. Beneath the surface, political structures evolved. Dynasties rose and fell. Rival houses competed for supremacy. Ancient kings ruled from Pike and other strongholds, but their authority often depended upon balancing ambitious vassals. The islands could unite under powerful rulers and fracture under weaker ones. This pattern repeated for centuries. Out of that turbulent history would emerge one of the most significant dynasties the islands ever produced, House Hoare. Why did House Hor succeed where so many rivals failed? The answer begins with consolidation. Before the rise of the Hors, the Iron Islands often experienced internal struggles among competing kings and regional powers. House Hor gradually expanded influence until it became the dominant ruling dynasty. Unlike rulers who focused solely on local rivalries, the Hors looked beyond the islands. They saw opportunity across the narrow waters separating them from mainland Westeros. The Ironborn had always raided foreign shores. The Hors envisioned something larger. The transformation accelerated under King Harwin Hor, remembered as Harwin Hardhand. During a period of division among the River Kings, Harwin launched a major campaign into the Riverlands. The timing proved ideal. The Storm Kings and local rulers had weakened one another through conflict. Harwin struck decisively. His forces conquered extensive territory east of the Iron Islands. For the first time, Ironborn rulers controlled not merely islands but large portions of the mainland. What generations of raiders had taken temporarily, Harwin sought to possess permanently. The conquest changed everything. The Riverlands were vastly richer than the Iron Islands. Broad rivers connected prosperous towns. Fertile lands supported large populations. Castles guarded strategic crossings. By bringing these territories under Ironborn rule, House Hor created a realm unlike anything seen before in island history. Ironborn lords now governed farmers instead of merely raiding them. Taxes flowed toward their rulers. Garrisons occupied mainland strongholds. The old dream of taking wealth from others evolved into the reality of ruling others. Yet success created new tensions. The Ironborn remained a minority, ruling a much larger mainland population. River lords resented foreign domination. Cultural differences persisted. Maintaining control required constant strength. Every sign of weakness invited rebellion. The Hors, therefore, pursued increasingly ambitious displays of power. Each generation sought to demonstrate that Ironborn authority was permanent. No ruler embodied that ambition more completely than the dynasty's final king. His name was Harren Hor, remembered forever as Harren the Black. Even among ambitious rulers, Harren stood apart. He inherited the largest Ironborn kingdom in history. His domains stretched from the Iron Islands deep into the Riverlands. Wealth poured into his treasury. Laborers worked across his lands. Yet Harren wanted more than power. He wanted immortality. He wanted a monument so enormous that future generations would never forget his name. On the northern shore of the God's Eye, he began constructing the greatest castle Westeros had ever seen. For 40 years, the project consumed vast resources. Stone was hauled from distant quarries. Thousands of workers toiled under brutal conditions. River lords supplied labor. Prisoners and small folk alike were forced into service. The result was Harrenhal. Its towers dwarfed every rival fortress. Its walls seemed almost impossibly massive. 5 colossal towers rose above the surrounding landscape. Even today, long after fire and ruin scarred its stones, Harrenhal remains the largest castle in Westeros. Harren believed its size made it invincible. But another question now approaches from the east. Why would a king devote decades to building the strongest castle in the world precisely when the nature of warfare was about to change forever? As Harren the Black watched his masterpiece rise beside the God's Eye across the narrow sea, the last dragon lords of Valyrian descent were preparing to alter the history of Westeros. Aegon Targaryen had not yet landed. The Iron Throne did not exist. Balerion the Black Dread had not yet cast his shadow over the continent. Yet the fate of House Hoare was already moving toward it, carried on dragon wings and the winds of history. Why did Harren the Black trust stone more than wisdom? The question lingers over the blackened towers of Harrenhal centuries after his death. By the time Aegon Targaryen began his conquest of Westeros in 2 BC, Harren ruled the most powerful Ironborn kingdom ever assembled. His authority stretched across the Iron Islands and the Riverlands. His castle was unmatched in size. His armies were formidable, yet for all his strength, Harren faced a threat unlike any ruler before him. He understood castles, he understood fleets, he understood rebellions. Dragons belonged to a different world entirely. When Aegon landed at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush and established the Aegon Fort, the political map of Westeros changed almost immediately. The Targaryens possessed 3 dragons: Balerion, Vhagar, and Meraxes. Aegon rode Balerion, the Black Dread, the largest and most fearsome dragon in the world. His sister wives, Visenya and Rhaenys, rode Vhagar and Meraxes. Together, they commanded a military force unlike anything the kingdoms of Westeros had ever encountered. Traditional defenses suddenly became uncertain. Walls that had resisted armies for generations now faced dragonfire. Many rulers submitted, others resisted. Harren chose resistance. According to the histories, Aegon offered terms. Submission would allow rulers to retain lands and titles beneath Targaryen authority. Several great houses eventually accepted such arrangements. Harren refused. From the immense walls of Harrenhal, he believed himself secure. The castle's towers rose so high that they seemed to challenge the sky itself. Massive gates protected the entrances. Thick walls enclosed vast courtyards. To Harren, the fortress represented the ultimate expression of power. There is a tragic irony here. Harrenhal was built specifically to make its owner invulnerable. 40 years of labor had gone into its construction. Entire generations of workers lived and died creating it. River lords were taxed heavily to fund it. Countless lives were consumed by the project. Yet the very castle intended to guarantee Harren's immortality became the instrument of his destruction. The larger the fortress grew, the more confidently Harren placed his faith in stone. The more confidently he trusted stone, the less seriously he took dragons. The decisive moment arrived when Aegon approached Harrenhal. Harren retreated inside with his sons and household. The castle's gates closed. Its defenders prepared for siege. Had the attackers been ordinary armies, Harren's confidence might have been justified. No conventional force could easily storm such a fortress. But dragon warfare ignored the assumptions upon which castles were built. Walls protected against men, moats protected against men, gates protected against men. None of those defenses mattered against Balerion. As night fell, Aegon mounted the Black Dread and flew above Harrenhal. The event became one of the defining moments of Westerosi history. Dragonfire engulfed towers, walls, and halls. Stone itself began to melt. The tremendous heat warped battlements into twisted shapes, still visible centuries later. Harren and his sons perished within the fortress. The line of House Hoare ended in a single night. The greatest Ironborn dynasty ever to rule Westeros vanished beneath dragon flame. Visitors to Harrenhal in later centuries repeatedly encounter evidence of that destruction. Melted towers lean at unnatural angles. Stone appears to have flowed like wax. Even hardened warriors find the ruins unsettling. Jaime Lannister, Arya Stark, Brienne of Tarth, and many others pass through the castle during the novels. All confront the same reality. Harrenhal remains enormous, but it is a monument to failure rather than triumph. The greatest castle in the world could not save the man who built it. What happened to the Ironborn after their greatest dynasty died? A lesser kingdom might have collapsed entirely. Instead, the Iron Islands adapted. Aegon understood something important about conquest. Destroying a ruling family was easier than governing a rebellious region indefinitely. Rather than imposing a foreign dynasty upon the islands, he allowed the Ironborn to choose their own lord from among the major noble houses. This decision would shape island history for centuries. The choice ultimately fell upon House Greyjoy of Pike. Viken Greyjoy emerged as the new Lord Paramount of the Iron Islands. Unlike the Hoars, the Greyjoys had not ruled a mainland empire. Their power base remained rooted in the islands themselves. The transition represented more than a change in leadership. It marked the end of the Ironborn dream of dominating the Riverlands. The mainland territories once ruled by House Hoare passed to House Tully of River Run. For the first time in generations, the Ironborn were confined largely to their ancestral homeland. Yet another puzzle emerges here. Why did the Greyjoys endure when so many powerful houses vanished? Part of the answer lies in adaptability. The Greyjoys accepted the new political reality. They remained proud Ironborn rulers. They preserved island customs. They maintained authority over Pike and the surrounding isles, but they no longer challenged the Iron Throne directly, at least not immediately. The family survived because survival sometimes requires patience rather than defiance. The centuries that followed were not peaceful, but they were transformative. Under Targaryen rule, the Iron Islands became one region within a larger realm. King's Landing emerged as the political center of Westeros. Royal authority reached farther than ever before. Roads improved, trade expanded, new opportunities appeared. Yet the Ironborn never entirely abandoned the instincts formed during the Age of Sea Kings. Beneath the surface, the old stories remained alive. Captains still spoke of the Iron Price. Drowned priests still baptized followers in seawater. The drowned god still occupied a place in the hearts of many islanders. This tension between adaptation and tradition became one of the defining themes of Ironborn history. Some rulers sought closer integration with the mainland. Others dreamed of restoring the old way. Certain noble houses embraced trade and diplomacy. Others celebrated raiding and conquest. The conflict never truly disappeared. Instead, it passed from one generation to the next, like a tide moving in and out. Every crisis in Westeros would reopen the same ancient debate. And opportunities for crisis arrived with remarkable regularity. Rebellions erupted, dynasties changed, civil wars divided the realm. Whenever the Iron Throne appeared weak, voices across the islands began whispering familiar questions. Why should Ironborn answer to mainland kings? Why should they abandon the customs of their ancestors? Why should they accept a lesser role when legends spoke of sea kings who once ruled entire kingdoms? During one of the bloodiest conflicts in Targaryen history, those questions would find a particularly dangerous champion. His name was Dalton Greyjoy, and history would remember him as the Red Kraken. Why do the Ironborn seem to come alive whenever the rest of Westeros is tearing itself apart? The pattern appears so consistently across the centuries that it feels almost inevitable. During periods of strong central rule, the islands often adapt, trade, and cooperate. Yet when kings quarrel, dynasties fracture, or civil war erupts, old ambitions resurface like wreckage rising from the depths. The sea captains begin speaking once more of glory. The drowned priests remind listeners of ancient freedoms. The dream of the old way awakens. No figure embodied that pattern more completely than Dalton Greyjoy, the Red Kraken. Dalton Greyjoy became Lord Reaper of Pike during the reign of King Viserys I Targaryen. He inherited power at a remarkably young age and quickly developed a reputation for courage, aggression, and ambition. By the time the Dance of the Dragons erupted in 129 AC, Dalton was already one of the most formidable leaders in the islands. The Civil War divided House Targaryen into rival factions supporting Queen Rhaenyra Targaryen and King Aegon II Targaryen. Across the realm, noble houses chose sides. The Iron Islands saw opportunity. Rhaenyra's supporters, known as the Blacks, sought allies wherever they could find them. Dalton eventually declared for Rhaenyra. At first glance, this appears to be a straightforward political alliance. The reality was considerably more complicated. Dalton Greyjoy had little interest in the ideological questions surrounding succession. He was not fighting to defend legal precedent. He was not campaigning for constitutional principles. He saw a kingdom consumed by civil war and recognized a chance to enrich the Iron Islands through force. His target became the Westerlands. As dragons battled across the skies and rival Targaryens contested the Iron Throne, Ironborn longships descended upon the western coast. The Lannisters suddenly faced enemies arriving from the sea, while broader conflicts consumed their attention elsewhere. Towns were raided, ships were captured, wealth flowed back toward the islands. Dalton's captains accumulated treasure, livestock, weapons, and prisoners. The old traditions that many believed were fading returned with startling force. There is a revealing contrast here between Dalton and Harren the Black. Harren dreamed of ruling vast territories directly. He built castles and sought permanent domination. Dalton preferred mobility. His power flowed from fleets rather than fortresses. He did not attempt to recreate the Hoare Empire. Instead, he exploited weakness wherever he found it. In many ways, he represented a more traditional Ironborn model of leadership. The sea remained his kingdom, and opportunity his guiding principle. Contemporary accounts and later histories consistently describe Dalton as charismatic and fearless. Warriors flocked to his banner. Captains competed for his favor. Victories enhanced his prestige. Yet the very qualities that made him successful also generated enemies. Raiding creates wealth, but it also creates resentment. Every burned village leaves survivors. Every captured ship leaves relatives seeking revenge. Throughout Westerosi history, Ironborn successes frequently contain the seeds of future retaliation. The Dance of the Dragons eventually ground toward its bloody conclusion. Dragons died, princes died, queens died. Entire noble houses suffered catastrophic losses. By the end of the conflict, House Targaryen remained on the throne, but it emerged deeply weakened. Dalton, however, did not live long enough to enjoy the long-term consequences. In 133 AC, he was murdered. The exact circumstances vary depending upon the source. Some accounts describe a woman seeking revenge. Others preserve different versions of events. What remains certain is that the Red Kraken's career ended abruptly, not on a battlefield but through assassination. His death highlights one of the recurring themes of Ironborn history. Exceptional warriors often rise quickly. Maintaining lasting political stability proves much harder. The islands repeatedly produce figures capable of terrifying their enemies. They produce fewer rulers capable of permanently resolving the tensions between tradition and practicality. After Dalton's death, the fundamental questions remained unanswered. Could the Iron Islands prosper within a unified realm, or was their destiny tied forever to the old way? Why did the drowned god remain influential, even as maesters, merchants, and mainland customs spread through the islands? To answer that question, it helps to look beyond politics and into everyday life. The Citadel sent maesters to Ironborn castles, just as it did elsewhere in Westeros. Ravens carried messages, lords maintained records, trade brought foreign goods. Yet none of these institutions offered the emotional certainty provided by the drowned priests. When storms threatened fishing fleets, people prayed to the drowned god. When sailors vanished at sea, families turned to the faith for comfort. When warriors sought courage before battle, ancient prayers remained familiar companions. The religion also possessed something that many outside observers underestimated. It adapted without appearing to adapt. Drowned priests continued using traditional language, traditional rituals, and traditional symbols. Yet generations passed, circumstances changed, and the faith remained relevant. A fisherman, a captain, a lord, and a reaver could all see reflections of their own lives within its teachings. The sea connected them. The sea threatened them. The sea sustained them. As long as those realities remained true, the drowned god retained power. Among the most striking examples of that endurance is the institution of the King's Moot. Long before the conquest, Ironborn tradition held that captains and warriors could choose a king through public acclamation. The practice largely disappeared for centuries as hereditary succession became dominant, yet the memory survived. Songs remembered it, priests remembered it, noble families remembered it. Like many ancient Ironborn customs, it never fully vanished beneath the surface. That dormant tradition would become extraordinarily important generations later. After the deaths of dragons, after the fall of the whores, after the reigns of countless lords and kings, the King's Moot would return. It would be called not by a conqueror or a lord, but by a drowned priest, convinced that the drowned god still guided the destiny of the islands. When that moment arrived, ancient bones would once again overlook assembled captains on Old Week. The words of forgotten sea kings would echo through the wind. And at the center of it all would stand a Greyjoy whose faith was stronger than his fear. Before we reach that gathering, however, another age must pass. The Targaryen dragons would disappear, new dynasties would rise, the Iron Throne would survive rebellions and crises, the Iron Islands would continue wrestling with the same dilemma that had haunted them for centuries. Every generation inherited two competing visions. One looked toward trade, stability, and cooperation with the mainland. The other looked towards salt spray, long ships, and the promise of taking rather than buying. Neither vision ever achieved complete victory. The struggle simply waited for the next lord, the next crisis, and the next storm. Why did the Ironborn repeatedly rebel against rulers they could never truly defeat? It is one of the most persistent patterns in their history after Aegon's conquest. Time and again, the Iron Islands confronted powers larger, richer, and more populous than themselves. The Targaryens possessed dragons. Later, kings commanded the combined resources of the Seven Kingdoms. Logic suggested accommodation. Experience suggested caution. Yet logic and experience often struggled against memory. The legends of sea kings, reavers, and the old way continued whispering from the past. The centuries following the Dance of the Dragons witnessed major transformations across Westeros. The last dragons gradually vanished. The Targaryen dynasty endured, but without dragons, its authority increasingly depended upon politics, alliances, and military power rather than overwhelming supernatural force. For many regions, this changed little. For the Ironborn, however, the disappearance of dragons altered psychological realities. The impossible weapon that had destroyed Harrenhal no longer dominated the skies. Old ambitions became easier to imagine. Several Greyjoy rulers attempted different approaches to governance. Some favored trade and stability. Others leaned more heavily toward traditional Ironborn values. One of the most important figures was Lord Quellon Greyjoy, father of Balon, Euron, Victarion, Aeron, and Urigan Greyjoy. During the reign of King Aerys, the second Targaryen, Quellon pursued reforms that moved the islands toward closer integration with the mainland. He discouraged certain raiding practices. He sought improved relations with the rest of Westeros. He promoted trade and modernization. In many respects, Quellon represented one possible future for the Iron Islands. Yet even Quellon's story reveals how difficult change could be. Many traditionalists viewed reforms with suspicion. The old way remained deeply embedded in island identity. Captains who glorified reaving did not necessarily welcome restrictions. Noble houses benefited differently from trade than from raiding. Cultural memory exerted enormous influence. Quellon could encourage change, but he could not erase centuries of tradition. The sea itself seemed to preserve old habits. The death of Quellon Greyjoy during Robert's Rebellion in 283 AC marked a turning point. Quellon had sailed in support of the Iron Throne against the rebels. He died during the conflict, and leadership passed to his son, Balon Greyjoy. Where Quellon often looked forward, Balon looked backward. He admired older Ironborn traditions. He believed the islands should reclaim their independence. Most importantly, he believed the moment was favorable. The Targaryens had fallen. A new king sat the Iron Throne. Change created opportunity. Why did Balon believe independence was achievable in 289 AC? From one perspective, his reasoning was understandable. Robert Baratheon had won the throne through rebellion. The realm had recently endured civil war. Dynasties had changed. Balon interpreted these events as signs of weakness. He crowned himself king of the Iron Islands and declared independence from the Iron Throne. For a brief moment, the old dream returned. The Ironborn once again had a king rather than a lord paramount. The response from the mainland was swift. King Robert Baratheon assembled a coalition of powerful lords. Eddard Stark marched from the north, Stannis Baratheon commanded the royal fleet. Tywin Lannister supported the campaign. The rebellion became a lesson in the realities of power. Ironborn courage remained formidable. Their fleets remained dangerous. Yet the combined strength of the Seven Kingdoms vastly exceeded that of the islands. The war moved steadily against Balan. One of the most significant engagements occurred off Fair Isle, where Stannis Baratheon achieved a major naval victory against the Iron Fleet. Ships burned upon dark waters. Captains died. Experienced sailors were lost. The defeat weakened Ironborn resistance and opened the path for further operations. Even so, the conflict was far from bloodless. The Ironborn fought stubbornly, defending their homeland with characteristic determination. The campaign culminated in the assault on Pike. The castle itself had long symbolized Greyjoy authority. Its towers rose from sea-sculpted stone. Rope bridges connected isolated keeps above crashing waves. During the attack, forces led by Robert's allies stormed key positions. One famous episode involved Thoros of Myr, who reportedly became the first man through the breached walls after setting aside caution in favor of bold action. The fighting proved brutal. When the war ended, Baelon's rebellion lay in ruins. The consequences shaped the next generation of Greyjoy history. Baelon's eldest sons, Roderick and Meryn Greyjoy, died during the conflict. The losses devastated the family. To ensure Baelon's future loyalty, his surviving son, Theon Greyjoy, was taken as a ward and hostage by Lord Eddard Stark. Theon was only a child. He left the Iron Islands and traveled north to Winterfell. There he would spend years alongside Robb Stark, growing up between two worlds and belonging fully to neither. That arrangement created one of the most fascinating identity conflicts in the novels. Theon learned northern customs. He hunted with Robb. He trained under Winterfell's masters at arms. He came to know Eddard Stark's household intimately. Yet he never stopped being Balon Greyjoy's son. The sea remained part of his inheritance. The drowned god remained part of his heritage. When readers later encounter Theon as a young man, they witness someone pulled between competing visions of himself. Meanwhile, Balon outwardly accepted defeat. The Iron Islands remained within the Seven Kingdoms. The kingly crown disappeared, trade resumed, peace returned. Yet beneath the surface, little had truly been resolved. Balon had lost the war, but he had not abandoned the dream. Many Ironborn shared his frustration. They viewed submission as temporary rather than permanent. The old stories remained powerful. Every drowned priest still remembered them. Every captain still heard them in songs. Another question now begins to emerge from the gathering shadows. What happens when a man spends years dreaming of a lost kingdom and suddenly sees a second chance? In 298 AC, King Robert Baratheon would die. The realm would fracture into competing factions. Robb Stark would proclaim himself king in the north. Renly Baratheon, Stannis Baratheon, and Joffrey Baratheon would all claim authority. The War of the Five Kings would begin. For most of Westeros, it was a catastrophe. For Balon Greyjoy, it looked very much like the opportunity he had been waiting for since the day his first rebellion failed. Why did Balon Greyjoy attack the north instead of the Iron Throne? Few decisions in the War of the Five Kings have inspired more debate among readers. In 299 AC, Robb Stark approached Balon with an offer. The young king in the north sought an alliance. The Starks and Greyjoys could potentially unite against the Lannisters. Theon Greyjoy carried the proposal to Pike, believing his father would seize the opportunity. Instead, Balon rejected it completely. He saw the North not as a partner, but as prey. To understand the decision, you must stand for a moment upon the wind-swept bridges of Pike and see the world through Baelin's eyes. The North was vast but thinly populated. Robb Stark had marched south with much of its military strength. Castles and coastal settlements appeared vulnerable. The Lannisters remained powerful despite setbacks. Attacking them directly promised difficult battles. The North seemed easier. Balon was not thinking like a diplomat seeking alliances. He was thinking like an ironborn king seeking conquest. The consequences rippled across the entire war. Victarion Greyjoy led fleets against the western coast of the North. Deepwood Motte fell. Moat Cailin, the great fortress controlling passage into the north, was seized by ironborn forces. Torrhen's Square came under attack. Coastal settlements burned. For a brief period, it appeared that Balon's gamble might succeed. The Ironborn established footholds across northern territory. Once again, longships carried warriors into lands that had not expected invasion. No individual suffered more from these events than Theon Greyjoy. After spending years at Winterfell, he returned to Pike expecting a welcome. Instead, he encountered suspicion and disappointment. Balon viewed him as softened by northern influence. His sister Asha Greyjoy mocked many of his assumptions. Theon desperately wanted to prove himself. That desire drove many of his most disastrous choices. Seeking glory and recognition, he launched an audacious strike against Winterfell itself. The capture of Winterfell remains one of the most shocking episodes in A Clash of Kings. Theon possessed only a small force. Through speed, surprise, and boldness, he seized the castle while many of its defenders were absent. For a moment, the impossible appeared accomplished. The son of Balon Greyjoy held the ancient seat of House Stark. Yet victory quickly became a trap. Winterfell could be captured. Holding it proved another matter entirely. As resistance grew around him, Theon's situation deteriorated. The disappearance of Bran and Rickon Stark, the murders of the Miller's boys presented as their bodies, and the collapse of local support pushed him toward increasingly desperate actions. The young man who had once laughed with Robb Stark found himself isolated within hostile walls. His story transformed from one of ambition into one of tragedy. By the time Ramsay Snow entered the narrative surrounding Winterfell's fall, Theon's fate was already turning dark. Yet while Theon's personal disaster unfolded, another drama was developing far away on the Iron Islands. Balon Greyjoy died under mysterious circumstances in 299 AC. According to official accounts, he fell from a bridge on Pike during a storm. Given the castle's architecture, such an accident was entirely plausible. Wind howls constantly around the towers. Rope bridges sway above crashing waves. Countless visitors find them unsettling. Nevertheless, the timing immediately raised questions. Who killed Balon Greyjoy? The novels never provide a simple answer. The strongest evidence points toward Euron Greyjoy. In a storm of swords, a mysterious, faceless man known as the Alchemist appears in Old Town. Later, Euron casually remarks that he once threw a dragon egg into the sea and implies familiarity with the Faceless Men. In A Feast for Crows, a man called the Ghost of High Heart speaks of a man without a face waiting on a bridge. Many readers connect these clues and conclude that Euron arranged Balan's assassination through faceless men agents. The books stop short of explicit confirmation, but the evidence is substantial. Balan's death created a succession crisis unlike any the islands had faced for generations. His surviving brothers possessed very different visions for the future. Victarion Greyjoy was a legendary warrior and fleet commander. Aeron Damphair represented the authority of the drowned god. Euron Crow's-Eye had spent years in exile, earning a reputation so disturbing that even hardened Ironborn often spoke of him uneasily. Each embodied a different possibility for the islands. Why does Euron Greyjoy feel so different from every other Ironborn leader? The question haunted many characters before he ever arrived on Old Wick. Traditional Ironborn figures like Balan, Victarion, and Aeron remained rooted in familiar customs. Euron embraced something stranger. He had sailed farther than almost any living Ironborn. Stories claimed he visited Ashai, Korth, and distant corners of the known world. Sailors whispered of warlocks, dark magic, and forbidden knowledge. Whether every tale was true mattered less than the atmosphere surrounding him. Euron seemed to belong to a larger and more dangerous world. The responsibility for resolving the succession fell largely upon Aeron Damphair. Unlike Balan, Aeron cared less about political calculations than spiritual legitimacy. He feared Euron profoundly. He considered him corrupt, godless, and blasphemous. To prevent a straightforward inheritance, Aeron reached back into ancient tradition. He called for a king's moot. For the first time in centuries, the captains and warriors of the Iron Islands would gather on Old Wick beneath the ancient bones of Naga and choose their ruler according to the customs of legendary sea kings. As word spread across the islands, ships began converging upon Old Wick. Captains arrived from Great Wake, Harlaw, Saltcliffe, Orkmont, and Blacktide. Noble houses prepared their claims. Priests offered prayers beside crashing surf. The ribs of Naga cast long shadows across the gathering crowds. Ancient traditions, dormant for generations, stirred back to life. Aeron believed the drowned god would guide the choice. He could not yet see that the King's Moot would unleash forces far older and darker than any storm rising from the sea. Why did the King's Moot choose the most dangerous man present? As dawn broke over Old Wick, thousands gathered beneath the immense weathered ribs of Naga. Salt wind swept across the hill. Priests of the drowned god moved among the crowds. Captains stood beside warriors who'd spent their lives at sea. Noble houses displayed their banners. The scene connected the living Ironborn to centuries of forgotten history. For perhaps the first time since the age of the ancient Sea Kings, tradition itself seemed more powerful than hereditary succession. The King's Moot remains one of the most distinctive political institutions in all of Westeros. Unlike the hereditary monarchies that dominate the continent, the King's Moot allowed captains and warriors to acclaim a ruler publicly. Aeron Damphair believed the ancient custom would prevent Euron from simply inheriting Balan's position. Instead, he hoped respected alternatives would emerge. Victarion Greyjoy possessed military prestige. Asha Greyjoy offered a practical vision of the future. Aeron trusted that the gathered Ironborn would reject a man he viewed as a blasphemous monster. Asha Greyjoy spoke first among the major claimants. Her proposal reflected realities many captains preferred to ignore. She argued that the Iron Islands lacked the strength to conquer and hold vast territories. Endless war against the entire continent promised eventual disaster. Instead, she advocated consolidating existing gains in the north and strengthening Ironborn prosperity through practical governance. It was one of the most sensible political programs presented that day. Yet sensible arguments do not always prevail during moments charged with myth and ambition. Victarion Greyjoy offered something different. Massive, scarred, and widely respected as a warrior, he embodied traditional Ironborn virtues. He had commanded fleets. He had fought in battle. Many captains admired him. Yet Victarion possessed a fatal weakness in political contests. He was direct where others were subtle. He relied upon reputation where others used spectacle. Against ordinary rivals, his standing might have been enough. Against Euron, it was not. Then Euron Crow's eye stepped forward. The moment feels almost theatrical, even on the page. Euron did not merely promise victories, he promised wonders. He displayed exotic treasures gathered during years of wandering. He spoke of distant lands beyond the experience of most listeners. Most importantly, he presented a dragon-binding horn called Dragonbinder. The artifact was enormous, dark, and inscribed with Valyrian glyphs. When one of Euron's men sounded it, witnesses described a terrible note that seemed to shake the air itself. What exactly is Dragonbinder? The books deliberately leave room for uncertainty. The horn certainly appears magical. The man who blows it dies horribly, his lungs and chest seemingly burned from within. Euron claims the horn can bind dragons to its master's will. Victarion later receives the artifact and carries it towards Slaver's Bay during events in A Dance with Dragons. Whether Dragonbinder truly functions as advertised remains unresolved, yet at the King's Moot, certainty was almost irrelevant. The possibility alone transformed perceptions. Euron understood something fundamental about Ironborn psychology. He offered not merely conquest, but transcendence. Balon had dreamed of restoring the old way. Victarion represented a stronger version of Balon's vision. Euron promised something larger. He spoke of dragons, empires, and a future beyond the imagination of ordinary captains. Standing beneath Naga's bones, surrounded by symbols of ancient greatness, many listeners found themselves captivated. The King's Moot acclaimed him king. For Aeron Damphair, the result was a catastrophe. He had called the King's Moot to preserve tradition. Instead, tradition elevated the very man he feared most. Aeron viewed Euron not simply as a political rival, but as a spiritual threat. Throughout A Feast for Crows, and especially the preview chapters of The Winds of Winter, his horror becomes increasingly apparent. He believes Euron mocks the gods, violates sacred boundaries, and seeks power without moral restraint. In Aeron's eyes, the crow's eye is not the fulfillment of Ironborn destiny. He is its corruption. Why does Euron feel almost disconnected from the rest of the setting? Many readers have noticed that he carries an atmosphere different from nearly every other character. Most rulers in A Song of Ice and Fire pursue familiar goals: land, crowns, wealth, revenge, survival. Euron seems drawn toward something stranger. He speaks of gods and dragons in the same breath. He collects sorcerers, warlocks, and priests. He surrounds himself with silence and fear. Even hardened Ironborn often react to him with unease rather than loyalty. Some of the darkest revelations come through Aeron's later captivity. In the preview chapter known as The Forsaken, Aeron endures imprisonment aboard Euron's flagship, Silence. The vessel itself is infamous. Euron removed the tongues of his crew, ensuring that no sailor aboard could speak. The image is unforgettable, a ship gliding across black water crewed by mute men serving a smiling king. Aeron's visions and experiences aboard Silence blur the line between prophecy, nightmare, and reality. Yet regardless of interpretation, they reveal the depth of his terror. The contrast between Aeron and Euron illuminates a deeper conflict within Ironborn culture. Aeron represents continuity. He believes the drowned god provides meaning, order, and identity. Euron represents radical transformation. He seeks power wherever it can be found, whether through ancient artifacts, foreign sorcery, or forgotten knowledge. Both men draw upon Ironborn traditions, but they draw entirely different lessons from them. One looks backward toward sacred origins, the other looks outward toward unknown horizons. Yet Euron's rise also forces us to revisit an older mystery. Who truly built the foundations upon which Ironborn civilization rests? The King's Moot occurred beneath Naga's bones. The Greyjoys ruled from the sea stone chair. The oldest legends speak of sea dragons, mermaids, and divine kings. Throughout their history, the Ironborn preserved fragments of stories older than recorded memory. As Euron pushed toward increasingly strange ambitions, those ancient mysteries began to feel less like folklore and more like clues. Somewhere beneath the waves and legends, unanswered questions still waited. Who built the sea stone chair? The question sits at the center of Ironborn history like a dark stone beneath deep water. Thousands of years of wars, kings, and religions have passed around it, yet no definitive answer exists. The chair stands within Pike, carved from a strange, oily, black stone unlike the gray rocks surrounding it. Ironborn tradition treats it as ancient beyond memory. When recorded history begins, the chair is already there. No king claims to have built it. No chronicle records its construction. It simply waits, as though it belongs to a forgotten world that existed before the Ironborn themselves. The mystery becomes even more intriguing when compared with other locations in George R.R.R.R. Martin's world. Similar oily black stone appears in distant regions separated by vast oceans and continents. The fortress foundations beneath the Ashai by the Shadow are built from it. Structures on the Isle of Toads in Sothorios share comparable characteristics. Fragments appear elsewhere across the known world. Meisters have debated these similarities for generations. No consensus exists. The distances involved are enormous, yet the resemblance remains difficult to dismiss entirely. The Ironborn preserve their own explanations. Some legends speak of the Deep Ones, mysterious sea-dwelling beings connected to ancient myths. Others attribute everything to the drowned god and the Grey King. None of these stories can be verified, yet they reveal an important truth about Ironborn identity. Unlike many cultures that explain the unknown through scholarship, the Ironborn explain it through myth. Their greatest mysteries are not problems to solve. They are sacred inheritances. What if the legends preserve distorted memories of real events? This is where interpretation begins, carefully replacing certainty. Throughout A Song of Ice and Fire, myths often contain fragments of historical truth. The stories of the Long Night likely preserve memories of a genuine catastrophe. Tales surrounding Bran the Builder may reflect an actual historical figure whose accomplishments expanded through centuries of storytelling. The Grey King legends may operate similarly. They are almost certainly exaggerated, yet exaggeration does not require complete invention. Consider Naga's bones on Old Week. The official explanation offered by many Meisters is straightforward. They are the remains of enormous whales or other giant sea creatures. That interpretation makes practical sense, yet the bones remain one of the oldest sacred sites in the Iron Islands. King's moots gather there, pilgrims travel there, drowned priests invoke ancient memories there. The physical reality of the bones matters less than their symbolic role. Whether Naga was a sea dragon, a whale, or something entirely forgotten, the site preserves continuity with the deepest layers of Ironborn culture. Another question emerges from the relationship between the drowned god and the wider magical landscape of the novels. Why does the religion appear so isolated from other supernatural traditions? The followers of R'hllor produce shadow assassins and prophetic visions. The old gods remain connected to greenseers and weirwoods. The warlocks of Korth practice their own forms of magic. By contrast, the drowned god often appears more symbolic than overtly supernatural. Yet appearances can be misleading. Aaron Dampere experiences powerful visions. Some may result from fasting, exhaustion, or religious fervor. Others seem more difficult to explain. The Forsaken chapter presents imagery that many readers interpret as prophetic. Aaron's dreams repeatedly connect Euron to darkness, blood, and apocalyptic transformation. Whether these visions originate from divine intervention, latent magic, or the damaged perceptions of a traumatized man remains unresolved. Martin deliberately leaves room for multiple interpretations. The uncertainty itself becomes part of the atmosphere. Euron's ambitions push these mysteries into even sharper focus. Unlike traditional Ironborn leaders, he actively seeks magical power. He pursues dragons. He collects priests from multiple faiths. He experiments with artifacts linked to forgotten civilizations. In doing so, he becomes a bridge between Ironborn mythology and the broader supernatural forces awakening across the world. The old stories suddenly feel relevant again. Ancient legends no longer belong solely to the past. They begin pressing against the present. Yet when you step back from individual mysteries, a larger pattern appears. The Ironborn have spent centuries struggling between two competing identities. One identity looks toward pragmatism, trade, adaptation, and survival within larger political systems. The other looks toward the sea, the old way, and ancestral glory. Quelyn Greyjoy represented one path. Balon Greyjoy represented another. Asha and Victarion reflected different responses to the same dilemma. Even Aeron and Euron, despite their profound differences, remain products of that ancient tension. This is why the history of the Iron Islands feels different from the histories of many other regions. The Reach expanded through agriculture. The Westerlands built wealth through gold. The Riverlands endured because of geography and rivers. The Ironborn defined themselves through memory. Again and again they returned to the same stories. The Grey King, Naga, the Drowned God, the King's Moot, the Iron Price. Those ideas survived invasions, conquests, dynastic changes, dragons, and civil wars. They endured because they answered a question every Ironborn eventually faced. Who are we? And so we return to the sea. The storm that opened our journey has begun to fade. Moonlight glimmers across black water surrounding Pike. Far below the castle's bridges, waves continue their endless work against stone. Somewhere on Old Wake, the ancient ribs of Naga still stand against the wind. Somewhere in the drowned halls, imagined by generations of believers, sea kings feast beside the drowned god. And somewhere beneath every legend, every prayer, and every unanswered mystery, the deep waters keep their secrets, just as they always have, waiting beyond the reach of memory. If you listen closely to the history of the Iron Islands, you begin to notice that it is not really a story about victory or defeat. Heron the Black built the largest castle in Westeros and died within it. Balon Greyjoy crowned himself king and watched his dream collapse. Dalton Greyjoy filled his ships with plunder and left behind no lasting empire. Even Euron, for all his terrifying ambition, seems less interested in ruling than in grasping something larger and more dangerous than a crown. Again and again, power slips through iron-born fingers like seawater. Yet the Ironborn themselves endure. Their kingdoms rise and fall, their dynasties change, their fortunes shift with every generation, but the people remain. In Martin's world, that distinction matters more than many rulers ever understand. The great irony of the Ironborn is that they worship a god of drowning while spending their entire history refusing to sink. The drowned god teaches death and rebirth, and the islands seem to live out that lesson endlessly. The Hoars perish at Harrenhal, the Greyjoys replace them, the old way fades then returns, the King's Moot vanishes for centuries and then emerges once more beneath Naga's bones. Every age believes it is witnessing the end of something ancient, yet the tide retreats only to return again. The Ironborn survive because survival has become the deepest part of their identity. You can see the same pattern in the faith itself. Outsiders often dismiss the drowned god as a harsh religion born from rocks, storms, and isolation. Yet beneath the roughness lies a strangely profound idea. The sea takes everything eventually. Ships vanish, kings die, castles crumble, even dragons disappear from the world. The Ironborn know this better than most because they live beside that reality every day. Their religion does not promise escape from loss. It promises endurance after loss. It tells them that what matters is not avoiding the storm, but emerging from it stronger than before. This is why the ancient mysteries feel so important. The Seastone Chair, Naga's bones, the Grey King, the Deep Ones. None of them are merely puzzles waiting to be solved. They are reminders that every civilization inherits stories older than itself. The Ironborn do not fully understand those relics, just as the people of Westeros do not fully understand the Wall, the Long Night, or the true origins of many ancient wonders. Martin's world is filled with forgotten ages buried beneath recorded history. The farther back you travel, the more uncertain everything becomes. Yet those uncertainties shape the present as surely as armies and kings. Perhaps that is the deepest truth hidden beneath the waves. The Ironborn are often described as relics of an older world, stubborn people refusing to change. But that is only half the story. They change constantly. They adapt. They intermarry with Andals. They trade. They serve Targaryens, Baratheons, and others. Their rulers rise and fall with the fortunes of the realm. What never changes is the story they tell themselves about who they are. The sea remains the center of that story, binding together fishermen, priests, captains, and kings across thousands of years. And so, as the night grows quieter, you find yourself back where this journey began. The storm has passed beyond the horizon. The towers of Pike stand dark against the moonlit sky. Below them, waves continue their endless conversation with the rocks. A drowned priest waits in the surf, patient as the sea itself. He lowers another initiate beneath the cold water, and for a brief moment, there is only darkness, the sound of the tide, and the ancient rhythm of a people who have spent centuries rising again, harder and stronger from the depths.